we have to interrupt our previously scheduled programming of today's video, which should have been cooking with izen, a brand new edition of me showing my skills with my pasta, because we have an emergency today. Today the emergency is a large amount of balance tuning, a large amount of changes with a good amount of buffs, but also some important nerfs given to many of these specs. So we have to go quickly through all of these specs that have gotten buffed or nerfed. It's definitely a much larger amount of changes that we were expecting compared to the ones we got last week, where we only got the nerf to Holy Paladin and the nerfs to mages. Now we have way more changes. Let's go and see, for example, if all of the members of the Exodia comp will end up getting nerfed in this round of tuning. But we can start with a recurring change. You will feel like you have been here before, perhaps even a deja vu moment, because the first change of the patch is that Blood Death Knight has gotten its damage increased by 10%. Now, according to my sources, this is the 74th set of damage increases given to Blood Death Knight. We also mentioned last time when we were talking about tank damage that Blood Death Knight was finally getting to be not really the weakest of the tank damage profiles across all tanks, and now they're getting a further 10% buff. Now, if you look at this and you have some basic understanding of maths, buffing this DK average damage by 10% would bring them above the 84,000 DPS line, which would put them at the second highest DPS out of all tanks with this other 10% damage buff. So once more, Blizzard is continuing down this line of giving more and more damage to Blood Death Knight. This 10%, this last set of buffs should be the one that puts them ahead and as a pretty significant damage dealer in Mythic Plus when it comes to tanks. The second change is still for tanks, but this time we have the member of the Exodia comp, because the change is a nerf and it's to Guardian Druid. Now, much like I mentioned about Guardian Druid being perhaps the member of the comp in Mythic Plus that requires the least amount of nerfs, this one is the smaller nerf that a member of the God comp in Mythic Plus has received, because the nerf is Ursoc's Fury Absorb Shield is reduced to 50% of the damage you do with Thrash and Maul instead of 60%. This is your current Absorb Shield, your current HPS you are gaining from the Absorb Shield as a Guardian Druid. And this one going from 60 to 50% of your damage is it's almost a 20% nerf in terms to the power of your Absorb Shield. So in terms to your self-sufficiency, in terms to your self-healing, you're getting nerfed by a good amount. Still, not really anything that will break the spec or make them significantly weaker than the other tanks, especially given that you are already going up to be quite the strong self-healer from your standard strong Mythic Plus comp by having lots of HPS. Yes, sure, still not to the same level of HPS that a Blood Death Knight could have, of course, but still much more than all of the other tanks. So this nerf is, I guess, good if you consider Guardian being a bit ahead of the other tanks, but still not, knee-breaking, it's still not ruining the entire spec. We are, however, not done with our Exodia God meta comp of Mythic Plus, because what follows is the nerf of the day, because it's the largest set of changes overall, which is to Augmentation Evoker. Blizzard feels the need to add a note. Augmentation is overperforming in dungeons and is doing less direct damage than intended relative to the power of their buffing effects. These adjustments will increase their personal damage in all situations and moderately reduce the effectiveness of their buffs, in particular in dungeon content, not as much in the raid. The nerfs in question are that now close as clutchmates now causes your Ebonmite and Breath of Eons to be 20% more effective when not in the raid instead of 40%, so you lose a couple of percentage points of main stat buffs in Mythic Plus compared to the raid. You're also losing some minor damage to Fate's Mirror chance to proc, which is rather irrelevant given the damage of Fate Mirror was quite low for Augmentation, as well as, more importantly, talking about defensiveness, the max HP. The max max HP of Aspect's Favor when you use your defensive is no longer going to be 16% max HP increase, it's going to be a 10% max HP increase. When it comes to the personal damage buffs mentioned, now Ebon Might increases the damage of the Evoker by 20% instead of 10, and Eruption receives 40% more damage. The TLDR of this is that you're roughly losing 11,000 DPS from your Ebon Might plus Breath of Eon's nerf. You're also losing roughly 3,000 DPS from your Mirror nerf, but you are gaining almost 4,000 DPS from the buff and 3,500 something buff from Ebon Might doing more damage on yourself. So the actual damage nerf overall is a measly 3 something percent damage nerf for augmentation. It's of course more relevant the health nerf, the defensive nerf, the fact that now you have less healer power because of Ebon Might being nerfed, and the fact that now you have less HP, less max HP when you use your defensive. So it is overall a nerf. It's still not, a massive nerf that will put augmentation out of the meta. It's good though in particular that they also address not just the damage augmentation does, but also the defensiveness, the survivability that augmentation adds to the party. Now, we are tired of talking about nerfs of the meta comp. Let's go over some of the other specs that actually are getting buffed, starting from Hunters. All 3 Hunter specs are getting buffed, and if you look at the damage done in the raid, for example, all 3 Hunter specs do not seem to be having quite the nice time, for example, and even if you go over to something like Mythic Plus, it's not that survival and BM and marksmanship are also having too nice of a time either, so it's good that they get some buffs. First, Beast Mastery receives 15% damage increase to Barbshot, Cobrashot and Killshot. Now, 15% looks like a pretty good number to increase, however, you go and look at the actual damage they do in a Beast Mastery rotation and you realize that these buffs are actually kind of small. It's a roughly 2% buff in single target and a 1% buff in AoE for a Beast Mastery Hunter, so we are not talking about a significant buff. Same could be said for marksmanship, where they receive 10% more splash damage, more ricochet damage to their trick shot, aim shot and rapid fire. So the buff is primarily in AoE. It's almost a 3.5% AoE damage buff for marksmanship, which has admittedly quite the low AoE damage. When you look at the overall Mythic Plus key in terms of overall damage done, you can see that 116,000 overall DPS of marksmanship is actually quite on the low end. Effectively, it's the lowest of the damages of all the DPS except for the meme that is Assassination Rogue. So definitely a more warranted buff given to them, especially when you compare them, for example, to Beast Mastery Hunter, who has a significantly higher AoE damage nowadays compared to marksmanship. We do also have, however, the buff to Survival. Survival gets Mongoose Bite, Raptor Strike buffed by 5% both, and then Flanking Strike and Kill Command buffed by 10%. Now, in a similar note, these sources of damage are not the primary ways of doing damage for Survival, even if their bombs have, since Shadowlands gotten nerfed by quite a bit, they are still the major source of damage for a Survival Hunter, so these buffs will amount to be some 2% in single target and barely, not even, a 1% AoE damage buff for Survival. Survival wasn't really that weak in terms of broad AoE damage compared to other specs. It was just an average spec, so buffing slightly more their single target is perhaps more sensible, because for example, when you look at a pure single target boss like Magmorax, Survival is still quite on the low end, quite on the weak end, so they receive, I guess, a decent buff, although definitely nothing that will shake the meta thanks to this buff to Survival Hunters. We then have a nerf, which is kind of sad because it's a warranted nerf, it's a needed nerf because it's a nerf to the damage of Brewmaster. We're talking about a 3-ish% AoE damage because their Spinning Crane Kick deals 20% less damage and their Keg Smash deals 5% less damage. Now, we have talked about this before. We have talked about the damage of Brewmaster Monk being way ahead of the rest of the tanks. So yes, if we had to talk about being fair, nerfing Brewmaster's damage is fair. However, it's not that Brewmaster is particularly meta, is particularly strong in the tankiness department, in how squishy they are in a Mythic Plus key, so it would have been nice to see some compensation buffs to their tankiness while you're nerfing their damage. At the moment though, all we have are the damage nerfs. Talking about Monk, the other part that gets buffed is Windwalker, which receives a flat 10% damage buff to Rising Sun Kick, Fist of Fury and Blackout Kick. Tiger Palm getting buffed doesn't really matter that much, it's only the first three that matter. The reason why they matter is because they are basically the three main abilities of a Windwalker Monk, and all of these three getting buffed will amount to a 4 to 5% damage increase in both single target and AoE, which is good. It's good in particular because when you look at the AoE damage of a Windwalker Monk, once more, it's in the middle of the pack, it's in the average of AoE damage in a Mythic Plus key. But when you look at the single target of a Windwalker Monk, they are amongst the weakest of the specs. So it's a decent, warranted and needed buff to Windwalker. In AoE, okay, fine, but definitely more important to have their single target buffed overall. Talking about another thing, tank damage, this is a bizarro world because we are getting protection Paladin damage getting buffed by 8%. It looks like it was just yesterday when we were talking about Prot Paladin having tons of damage and having the most damage out of all tanks. Somehow, along the way, Prot Paladin has been getting outscaled, has been slowing down their damage to the point where, in a totally surprising turn of events, they are now the weakest damage dealer in Mythic Plus, out of nowhere. So getting their damage buff by 8% will bring them closer to the 80-ish thousand DPS mark where the other more powerful tanks are currently sitting at. It would be interesting to know Blizzard's data to be buffing Protection Paladin by 8% but DK by 10%, even though DK is already out-damaging Protection Paladin by this point. Still though, it can't hurt to buff Protection Paladin's damage a bit more, given how weaker it has gotten recently. Then we have Priest. This one is the only buff and it's to Discipline, Luminous Barrier, Absorption increased by 30%. This one is pretty obvious. Blizzard has introduced Luminous Barrier to be a more useful addition and a more useful choice in Mythic Plus over the standard barrier talent. There is a problem though. Luminous Barrier is still too weak and no Discipline Priest is actually even bothering to take this new talent. So Blizzard is trying to incentivize more priests to start playing around with Luminous Barrier over the standard Power Word Barrier, at the very least in Mythic Plus. We will see if this will be enough to make more priests go over and play Luminous Barrier. However, now we have to take a break from the buffs and go back to talk about nerfs, because now we have the last member of the Exodia comp, the last member of the meta comp, after the first nerfs given to Holy Paladin and Fire Mage, and then the nerfs we saw now to Guardian and to Augmentation Evoker. The last member is also getting nerfed, the last member being Shadow Priest. So if you were to look at the entire list, you will be thinking most of these are just buffs. It's a flat out 12% damage increase to most of their profile. Actually, what matters more is the first part, the fact that now Psychic Link is going to splash your single target damage spells for 15% of their damage instead of 25% of their damage. So this is roughly a 40% damage nerf to Psychic Link, which is going to amount to well over a 10% basically AoE damage nerf to Shadow Priest. Meanwhile though, sure, all the other spells in here getting buffed will amount to a roughly 4% or more single target damage buff. Now, we have talked about this at length when we were looking at the raid, for example, how Shadow Priest was definitely more OP in Mythic Plus than in the raid, especially given that their single target in the raid is somewhat mediocre. Yes, overall, they can get by with some multi-target, etc, but in general, the single target was their weaker point. So now it's what is getting buffed, which is good. What is a little bit more surprising is that the AoE damage of a Shadow Priest was good was, one of the better ones overall, but still, perhaps it's a bit weird that overall, for example, a Shadow Priest's AoE DPS is nerfed more than a Fire Mage. It's kind of common to see situations like these. You open up any one of these top groups, which will be the exact same composition, of course, and you find, a typical gap of a Fire Mage out-damaging in AoE a Shadow Priest quite easily. You can look very good, very known and skilled Shadow Priest like Lucid and, easily gapped, no problem, 20% and more damage gap from a Fire Mage. So, nerfing Shadow Priest's AoE might be warranted because after all they have one of the highest ones, but still far below the actual damage of a Fire Mage. That's the more surprising set of changes for today. We then finish with yet another set of buffs given to Restoration Shaman's healing. As we mentioned multiple times, the Restoration Shaman's healing has been getting quite outscaled for quite a bit of time, so they are trying to continue to give them some aura buffs to make their overall healing a little bit more in line with the rest of the healers. And lastly, tank damage once more. Protection Warrior also got their damage buffed by 7%. Like we mentioned, when it comes to tank damage, the three lowest ones were these three, and these three just got buffed in damage. Again, it's somewhat surprising that they get buffed by 7% and they get buffed by 8% when DK gets buffed by 10% when they are ahead of both, but these buffs should make them more competitive now. Prot Paladin should be getting up to 77,000 DPS, Prot Warrior to 79,000 and Blood DK to 84,000 damage. So now you would have a much more even set of tanks in terms of DPS. Brewmaster also should be going down from 97 to somewhere around 92, 91, which is still more than the rest, of course, but now the gap amongst the DPS of tanks should be closer. For today, we of course don't care about PvP changes, so for today this is all we have in terms of spec changes. Yes, once more, before you start pointing it out in the comments, there are no mentions once more of rogues. Blizzard is contractually obligated, as we all know, to rework rogue specs in maybe 10.1.7, certainly by 10.2 we will have our rogue rework, so for now I guess they have given up on any further changes to the rogue specs. So besides that clear miss in today's patch notes, we have nothing else to talk about in this set of balance tuning. It's nice to see that at the very least in less than 2 weeks we have gotten the Exodia nerfed in all of its component. Yes, the amount of nerfs to all of the 5 specs is not enough to change this top comp, but at the very least it has been addressed in some way. Let's just put it that way. So with these rounds of tuning done for this Saturday, I believe it's time to leave each other. We are thanking, of course, as usual, all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, and of course, as usual, you can also support completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. So with these useless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I still think someone high up still has Fire Mages as a sweet spot. They really just can't avoid making them meta.